Deanna's experience encompasses over 16 years with Hyperion and 5 years with Oracle Financials, with industry focus in oil and gas, energy, insurance and financial services, health insurance, and entertainment. She holds an MBA in finance, a Bachelor's of Science in economics, and is a former certified public accountant. Deanna is also a certified implementation specialist for Hyperion Planning and Essbase and is a leader in the Hyperion community. She is a frequent speaker at our user group conferences and webcasts such as Oracle Open World, Kscope, Collaborate, OAUG Connection Point, and regional user groups throughout the U.S. Thank you, Deanna, for joining us today.
Thank you. And thank you all for attending my presentation. I'll start with an agenda. So we're going to first talk about PBCS as an introductory level, just to introduce you to PBCS if you're not familiar with it. And then we'll get into the approach to migrations, some of the pre-work that you will need to do prior to migrating, how to migrate to PBCS, and then get into security and data integration. So Oracle's Planning and Budgeting Cloud Service is also known as PBCS. It's a cloud-based application that's available to customers as a software as a service deployment model. So in that respect, it's a per user per month fee. It allows for flexible planning applications, and it's been optimized for deployment on the cloud. It includes all reporting and data management used today in the Hyperion Planning Suite. So essentially what Oracle did is take what was in Hyperion Planning on-premise and then port it over to the cloud, so it has essentially the same functionality. There are a number of customers and users that are currently using PBCS. It was launched a little over 2 years ago, and there are over 1,000 customers currently using the system with over 50,000 users. Actually, that statistic's a little outdated. I know it's now over 62,000 users. PBCS is used by clients in various industries, everything from financial services to the public sector. It's been built on over 15 years of innovation for building the on-premise model, and again, that's just been what's ported over to PBCS, again, the same functionality. It's available and supported by Oracle globally 24/7. So why do our clients move to the cloud? One big reason is that it requires no IT involvement. So things such as backups, patches, and upgrades that just happen automatically. There's no hardware investment to make and no maintenance needed by the client to perform any kind of patches or anything on the actual hardware or the software. So the subscription model allows for not having the need to make that upfront purchase. As we find our clients grow, they also don't need to buy more servers or don't need to install any new software either. They just need to update their subscription to allow for more users, and can also deploy additional plan types and applications as they need. So there's a very quick ROI with PBCS and a very quick implementation, or as we're talking today, migration is also very quick. People who love Hyperion, they love what it can do for reporting and analytics and the functionality. So it's a very trusted name in the EPM space, and you're being able to take advantage of all that functionality. Another reason why our clients will migrate to the cloud is that their current solution is too outdated and maybe it's unsupported. So it gives them a quick way to take advantage of the cloud. So how would you like to be able to always be current on the latest packages and versions? How about never having to worry about your service going down and always having a backup of your application? You never have to go through an upgrade process again, and you can simplify your data integration and mapping, and also you have access to your planning application through your phone or your tablet. You can always have IT personnel there to support you as well as needed. So I really love this slide because it's very graphical. It shows you how the patching is taken care of by Oracle, as are the backups, and additional tools such as diagnostic and tuning and monitoring is provided all out of the box from Oracle. So this slide talks about some of the new features that are coming to the cloud. I'm not going to go through all these features, but what is important to note is that when it comes to new features for Hyperion Planning, Oracle is deploying them on the cloud first. So once you're on the cloud, you will actually get access to that new functionality even before people who are on-premise. So next, the migration approach. So a little bit about the background. This presentation is about a specific client that I actually migrated. They were on version 9.3. They had one planning application, 3 plan types, 60 users, over 250 forms, 50 business rules, 40 calc scripts, and 140 reports. So overall, the number of objects that they needed to move was pretty large. So the scope of the project was essentially to lift and shift what they had on-premise to the cloud. We did want to first clean up the existing environment, clean up all the objects so there weren't a lot of extra things that were no longer there. We also cleared out any unneeded data, so they had not really cleared any data from when they started. So they had several years worth of data that could be deleted, as well as some like scenarios for budgets and forecasts for older years that were also not needed. The scope also included setting up both the test and the production environments and updating an ODI process to create flat files that were then loaded into PBCS. So the approach was to migrate their 9.3 application that had 3 different plan types to a lab environment. So this is something that a consulting firm can help you with. So we migrated them to version 11.123. This step would not be required if you're already on a version that has lifecycle management. So lifecycle management is a tool within the Hyperion suite which allows you to export and import objects and data very easily. But this client was on such an old release that we needed to upgrade them to a newer version and then use LCM from that point. So then the next step was to validate the objects and reconcile the data between their 9.3 and production environment and the lab environment. We migrated then from the lab to the PBCS test environment. We also, at that point, updated objects and reconciled some data and performed UAT. So we performed UAT on the PBCS test environment rather than the lab environment, rather than like having to go through that process twice. We then updated the metadata and data for any changes to production. This is kind of a step that sometimes people forget. It can take a little while to upgrade your applications and do this migration. So the whole time frame for the project was about 8 weeks. So during that time on production, there continued to be changes made by the client to their metadata and the data. So it was important to track all those changes so the same changes could be applied to PBCS. We then set up the PBCS production environment and then did the knowledge transfer and documentation for the client. So a little bit about the work that we did before we actually got started with the migration process itself. So we wanted to clean up all the old objects. So we removed things like forms, old business rules and calculation scripts that weren't being used, financial reporting reports that weren't used, and cleared out the data that was no longer needed. So this is an important step because you don't want to have to validate all these objects when they're no longer being used. So that was an important step. So the next thing that we did was with business rules. With on-premise, business rules are used in implementations prior to version 11.113. Between the versions 11.113 and 11.121, you can choose to either use business rules or calculation manager rules, and they can be used with a planning classic application. So with business rules or calculation manager, you make that choice when you actually first set up the application. Beginning with version 11.122, the only option is to use calculation manager for your business rules, and also PBCS requires calculation manager. So since the client was on like version 9.3, or if you're on any version prior to and 11.113, you're going to need this to do this step, or if you're between those two versions and you are not using Calculation Manager, it's important to also complete the following steps. So the first thing to do is to understand that business rule locations for Calculation Manager, the rules are at the plan type level, so rather than being at the application level. So with Calculation Manager, the rules are at a lower level than you would find in the traditional business rules. The definition of the business rule location will determine where the business rule will reside in Calculation Manager. So you need to make sure that the locations in your production environment are set properly for the migration. So the location needs to include the specific application and plan type it's being migrated to, or you cannot use all locations in that definition. So it's important to set the specific application and plan type in order for those rules to migrate correctly. If you need to have the same rule on multiple applications and you're currently having it set at that higher application level, you will need to create a new rule to associate with that other plan type and update the forms that need to use that rule. So the next is just a screenshot that shows what your locations should look like. So ideally, you really need to have it associated with one application and one plan type for it to come across correctly and not be associated with all locations. So the next thing that we did is set up a little tracker spreadsheet so that we could track all the changes that the users were making in production while we were migrating them to PBCS. So we just included things like the database name, an artifact name and type, and for example, in this case, this is the metadata update, so what the dimension was, what the parent name was, and what the changes were. So the last column was things like, we were adding a brand new member or updating a description. So we are tracking these changes so that when we went to production, that in PBCS, that these same changes would be applied. So the spreadsheet is just kind of a listing of what we needed to do, but the changes, we just made them manually. If you do have a lot of metadata changes as you're going through a migration process, you can set up spreadsheets in order to load them to PBCS to make it a little easier rather than doing it manually. So that all just depends on how many changes you need to apply. So the next step was migrating to a lab environment. Again, we had all of these objects that needed to be migrated. So the first thing that we did was wanted to document what those objects were in order to be able to later verify that things came across correctly. So the easiest way to do this for us was just to take some print screens. So the first one is a plan type application database list of the dimensions. So here we have the list of all the dimensions, whether it's sparse or dense, and how many members in the dimension and how many are stored. So this is a really good way to check that your metadata came across correctly, is to check these counts. Over here we have a list of all the different calculation scripts that we had in the application. So we took a print screen of that. With PBCS, calc scripts are not used, so these were converted to business rules, but that's very easy. If you just have them as scripts rather than graphical, it's really just essentially a copy and paste. So then we had a list of our actual business rules as well, and also some rules. So again, in PBCS, load rules are not used in PBCS. Instead, we use the data management system, but it was still good to document these so that we knew that they were taken care of in PBCS and through the data management process. We also took screen prints of our menus, our smart lists, all of our forms, and our FR reports. So we did those as print screens just because it's a lot easier than typing and things like that, and so I would recommend that to save some time. So to migrate to the lab, we first requested a backup from the DBA, and then the infrastructure team at our company went ahead and built out planning in the lab environment. So in order to import the data, though, we did a level 0 export from production, and we loaded that into the lab, and we cleared out any unneeded data through a calc script, and then we ran an aggregation calc script. We next did some high-level testing to verify all the objects that we just saw the lists of, and to verify all the member counts for each dimension. We then validated our business rules, that they were all migrated over to Calc Manager, and also that the variables were migrated as well. We then validated the data, and we did that at a very high level by comparing some key financial reports and forms. So next we migrated to PBCS test. So we've created an application shell and created the plan types that were needed. So one thing that's interesting to note is that in PBCS, the plan types are numbered 1, 4, and 8, versus in on-premise, they're numbered 1, 2, 3. We then next created just the dimensions, so just the root member of each dimension. We exported all the artifacts from the lab using lifecycle management. We then imported the metadata and then the other objects, such as the forms, the rules, the Calc Manager rules, and then reports and such. I'll get into this a little bit more later because the order that you import is important. Then we imported our data. Again, we did that level 0 export. We cleared some unneeded data, and we ran the aggregation. We then did a similar validation process as what we did to go to the lab environment. We then performed UAT on the PBCS test environment, and then migrated everything from test to production. So in PBCS, it's called application management in order to export and import objects, but it's essentially the same thing as LCM. So to create an application in PBCS, once you log in, you just click on Create Application, and then you click on New Application. You'll see that the screen to set up an application looks very similar to on-premise. You'll select your frequency, whether you're going to be using it monthly, weekly, or quarterly. You select your start and end years and your start period and what you want your distribution to be. So, and if you're using multi-currency, so yes, it's very similar to the screen in on-premise. So then we created, after we created the application shell, we then created the additional plan types and our custom dimensions. So the import order, so it's important to import things in the right order and verify each of the different types of objects as you go along. There's a lot of dependencies here. So first we imported the planning configuration settings and the S-based settings, and then smart lists. So when you import your metadata, if you're using smart lists, the metadata may include some counts and such that are linked to smart lists, so it's important to bring your smart lists across first, and then the metadata. So the order of the metadata would be to first bring in any dimensions that do not have any calculations, where they're have a calculation that is dependent on some other dimension, and then do the dimensions that do have calculations from other dimensions. You want to also verify your member counts at the end or even in between each load. I would recommend that you refresh the database each time you add a dimension so that you know that there are not any errors. If there are some errors, you can deal with them before you move on to the next dimension. Then we would import our or type in manually our substitution variables. Then we would bring across all the calculation scripts. Again, these need to be made into business rules because there are no calculation scripts in PBCS. Then for business rules, we would bring across the variables, then the templates, then the business rules themselves, then any rule sets, and then menus. So for example, a rule set is a set of a group of business rules. So you first want to bring your business rules in and then your rule sets. So the order of this matters as well. Then the next thing that I like to do is create the folders for the forms. If you create the folders manually, you will get them in the right order that you want them, rather than if you were to just import the forms. The folders may not come in the correct order that you want them. Next, we would import the forms and then task lists. So, actually, I should say forms and then composite forms. So if you have any composite forms, you would want to load them in after the forms. Then any task lists that you may have. So a task list can consist of a number of different things, including forms, so you want to do those next. And then typically I'll do the financial reporting reports last, just because we would validate things, all the other objects first, and typically would validate the reports last. And then import the data at the end, again importing the level 0 data and running an aggregation script. And then we would work on security. So I put security in brackets just because we did sort of a semi-automated way of loading in security. So we'll get to that at the end of the presentation. We'll talk about security. So some suggestions, again, are to refresh the database after you load every dimension. Import the account dimension last if possible, because that is the one that tends to be the most complicated. It has a lot of different properties and formulas and things, so it can have some issues. So I would recommend to import that last. So how to import your metadata. From PBCS, you would navigate to Administration here, and then underneath that you will see Import Export. And then on the screen you will see that you can select your entity to import, and then you can browse to a file to load. So this is how, for this client, we imported the metadata. We did have to make some tweaks to the exported files from our lab environment. So we did not use the application management to import the metadata files. We did it in this route so that we could load in the files after we had edited them. So here were the issues for why we had to edit some of those files. Firstly, the client had 2 attribute dimensions, and the attributes were not supported at the time. Attributes are currently supported in as so far as the metadata. You can create attribute dimensions, and you can associate them with the base dimension members. However, they're not available for reporting or SmartView yet. We're told that's going to be happening very soon. The company had 2 attribute dimensions, but we found that they weren't not actually using those attribute dimensions. Instead, they were using alternate hierarchies. And another option is to use smart lists if you really need them for reporting right away. So we edited the CSV file to remove the attribute dimension information in this case. We also found that the no year member was not created when you set up the shell application. You cannot do that manually in PBCS either, so the way to do that is just to create a little CSV file and import it. We also found that in this case, the client was on such an old version of planning that they had some instances of shared members that came before the stored members, and somehow, the environment was just so old that it actually allowed that when it shouldn't. So we had to fix those cases. We also found that there were some occurrences where the same shared member occurred more than once within a hierarchy. So this is an ASO restriction. It does not allow that. And the client wasn't going to be using ASO right away, but they didn't want to prohibit themselves from being able to take advantage of having an ASO application spun off from their plan types. So we went ahead and were able to make some changes to their hierarchies so that they only would have one occurrence of a shared member in each hierarchy. It wasn't too difficult. They had, lots of different alternate hierarchies and could easily make some changes and still get their reporting needs met. So this is just an example of what the file format looks like if you're taking the route of loading it in through a CSV file. Looks pretty much like what you've probably seen before. If you with planning, you'll see that there is a parent-child relationship, and then you'll have the default alias and things like what the properties are, whether the data is stored or dynamically calc'd and such, and the formulas and all the other kind of things like UDAs and smart lists and et cetera all appear here. So it's a pretty easy file to work with and then load into PBCS. So to import it, we would go to Application Management, and then you would click on wherever your snapshot is. This is where we're getting into loading the other objects other than the metadata. So you would just go here and select on the different objects that you're wanting to import, and then you would click on the import button. So again, application management looks very much like, lifecycle management in on-premise. So to import the forms, we needed to edit the XML files to edit that plan type number, which appears in the header. So in on-premise, the plan types are numbered 1, 2, and 3. Again, for PBCS, they're numbered 1, 4, and 8. So that required us to edit the XML files if they were plan type 2 or 3 in on-premise. So to import the reports, we exported them from Workspace, and then we found that some of the reports had S-based connections. With PBCS, you only have planning connections, so we needed to update those reports to use a planning connection. And then we also saw that some of the reports, again, the client was on a really old version. They were using the syntax POV alias. That syntax is no longer used in financial reporting reports. It's been deprecated. We did some testing around that. I wanted to make sure that these reports would still work and also work if they were edited. So if a new row was added and the report was saved, we did find that the old syntax still worked, but we do recommend that you use the new syntax, which is member alias. I'm kind of pointing out this little thing because every single client I've been to seemed to, build their reports with POV alias, and then they had issues with that sometimes going forward. So I just wanted to point this out. It was a very commonly used syntax before. So the next step was to reconcile production and the lab environment to the PBCS test environment. Again, we verified the member counts for each dimension, and that required a little bit of reconciliation because of the changes that we had made. We also compared the key financial reports and forms in order to validate the data. We validated all the business rules migrated properly, that the evaluation order and S-based settings were correct, that all the forms and business rules had the proper business rules attached. These other things are a little bit different in how you would want to test PBCS versus if you're upgrading, say, from on-premise. In this case, with PBCS, when you're migrating to PBCS, you need to make sure that every single form renders. And also on your reports, you want to make sure that every single report renders. I would recommend that you open up a form and then change it to some other point of view and make sure it renders again. And the same thing with the report. Open it up and then change it to something else and then make sure that it still renders. With PBCS, there are some restrictions as to the number of potential cells that a form or report can actually go out and fetch. So on-premise, some of the forms and reports may work fine, but you may find that you have an issue after going to PBCS, that some of them are just too big. So we did find a few forms and a few reports that were just too big, and so the workarounds there were to break out the form into multiple forms. You can also use composite forms after you've broken them out if that makes them a little bit more user-friendly. For reports, you would really need to break them into multiple reports. The client had some really, really large reports, so that's why we did need to break out a few of them. But in most cases, you should be okay, but it is very important that you do test all of the forms and reports, and there's a print screen of what the error message you would get if you hit that threshold. So that threshold is defined for all PBCS clients. Currently, it's at 500,000. So it's not something that you can change for a particular client or environment, unfortunately, and so that setting is a hard setting. For browsers, we also found that users were using different browsers, so things that worked for us as we were doing testing may not have worked for the client. So you need to make sure that your users are using browsers that are supported. So when you are testing and using PBCS, Firefox is the preferred browser. It does give you the best performance, but it also does support Internet Explorer and Chrome, and for your mobile devices, it also supports Safari. Security. So for security, the client needed to pass an audit test. So I really did want to redesign security. It is something that is really good to look at whenever you're doing an upgrade or a migration like this. Sometimes your security model gets outdated. Maybe you don't need all of your groups and users, so it's a good time to look at it and consider whether you can redesign it to make it easier to maintain as well. So in this case, it was out of scope to do that. We just didn't have the time, and it also, if we redesigned it, it would make it more difficult to pass the security audit check because they would be comparing it to the old production environment. So we ended up creating the users and groups manually. They can be loaded into PBCS, but we were on such an old version that it wasn't that if we exported out like the security from shared services, for example, it was not in the correct format. And there were a lot of like old products and things, not just planning, so we needed to edit that file down as well. So we found it just as easy that with a number of users and groups that we just created it manually. We did create some XML load files to load the planning dimension security, so the actual security on the like entities and accounts and things that the users had access to and what forms that they actually had access to. We did create an XML file. We created the file manually, but then once the file was created, we loaded it up. So it was still a lot easier than going into PBCS and doing it all manually, and I'll go into that in the next slide. Business rule security we also set up manually because they were on the old business rules, and now we're on Calc Manager. So we did that by creating a project and then assigning access to that project. One thing to note is that when users are first added to PBCS, even if it's like your test environment, they get sent an email with login instructions, and if you're just setting them up to test, you might want to follow up with an email that says, hey, ignore the email you just got, we're not ready, we're just setting you up. This is a real nice feature when you're in production though, because if you're adding a new person, they will get that email and it gives them everything that they need to know. But there's no way to actually turn that off. So when you're adding users and assigning roles, this is similar. There is no shared services in PBCS. However, it's a very similar concept. You do create roles and you add users and you put the users in those groups and roles. So I've just shown some print screens here that looks pretty similar to what you would see in on-premise. So for security, we went about that first by taking an export of PBCS after we created some security, like one user, a couple of users, a couple of groups, just to get what the format looked like. So interestingly, this is a little different than on-premise as well because a separate file is exported for each group rather than it all being in one file. So we then opened up that XML file in Excel. We inserted some rows between the top and the bottom row if we needed to add more rows for the structure. So the file itself, when you pull the XML file into Excel, it has like an arrange set, so that's why you need to insert rows in the middle. So after we made our adjustments and changes to the file, we then saved it as XML. We opened the XML file and just in like a text editor or something, and then just delete the header because when you save it from Excel, it creates a header that's not supposed to be there. And then you just save it, and then at that point you're able to import the file via Application Manager. So like LCM, you can just import it at that point. So here's a print screen of kind of what that looks like. So in this case, we have the objects, and then whether it's a form, whether the access is read or write, et cetera, whether it's member or descendants and such. So when we open it up in Excel, we just specify that we want to open it up as an XML table, and then you can make all the adjustments that you need to, and then save it again, and then open it up in a text editor and delete that header, and then you're able to import these files. A lot easier than actually going into PBCS and manually clicking and doing each of the changes for each of the different types of security you need to grant. Okay, the next thing is on data integration. So the client here was using an ODI process. Users would select from 3 different processes to run, one for the P&L and 2 different ones for the balance sheet files, and that would load directly into planning. So they had an automated process. For our first phase for PBCS, we changed that ODI process to, instead of loading directly into planning, it produced a flat file. We then did some formatting changes so that it could be loaded in the S-based native format. That's actually like the easiest format to use. Mostly that was done by just making some updates to the ODI process to do that, little formatting changes that we needed to do. We also added a suffix to the output file with a department number and a date timestamp. So what was happening was all these users were generating these files, and you don't want them to like stomp on each other before the admin actually could load the file. So by putting the suffix with the department number and the date timestamp, we could be sure that everything that was supposed to be loaded actually did get loaded, so by the administrator. So then the phase 2 of this was to more fully automate it. And I have some slides here following that talk a little bit about the automation with PBCS. So with PBCS, there is what's called an EPM Automate, which is a utility that allows you to remotely perform tasks. You can automate things like importing and exporting your metadata and your data. You can refresh the application. You can run business rules. You can list files and delete files. So essentially, this takes the place of what you might do with like a BAT script or MaxOwl. And then within data management, data management is essentially FDE, but kind of a light version of that doesn't have quite as much functionality. It provides a single systematic process for loading data from different systems into your target applications. It allows some simple ETL for the business users so they can control it rather than having to have IT do all the mappings and things. It provides visibility, traceability, integrity, and assists with the verification process. And again, allows end users to do some mapping. You define the targets and the sources. You can also drill through to sources if you want to drill into other systems or get more detail. And the process can be fully automated. There are some other data load methods as well if you're interested. Brand new, few weeks ago, you can now use FDM EE beginning with release 11.124.200 to actually bring data from your on-premise system into PBCS. So that's pretty nice if you still have, maybe you've got S-Base on-prem, but you're going to PBCS on the cloud and you need to do some integration, or if HFM is on-prem, you can use FDM EE to assist with all that automation. There's also a REST API if you want to get into your more custom processes. So I just wanted to thank you for participating in this webinar and pass it over to Greg to conclude.
Thank you, Deanna Sunde. And thank you all for joining us today for the webinar, Ready, Set, Cloud, Migrating from On-Premise to PBCS. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Deanna's and my contact information is displayed on your screen.